Okay, welcome back. This is Professor TOVANCHE, and today we are going to start talking about Black life in the South. Specifically, here we're going to be talking about Black folk living in the slave-holding South, and next time, of course, we'll be talking about the free population, particularly in the North. Okay, let's make sure I'm recording, and I am. Okay, so by the 1820s, slavery has really just expanded dramatically. It's expanded in several ways by the 1820s, and it will continue to do so into the 1860s, as you can see by this map, in terms of where slavery existed originally, and then, of course, how it spread into those green areas, and then, of course, by 1850, 1860, it's all the way into these areas over here, all the way into Texas. Point is, already by the 1820s, it has expanded. It's expanded economically and geographically. We know that the cotton gin has made cotton king. It has also made cotton a staple that really holds the North and the South together. The North buys a lot of cotton. The South sells a lot of their cotton to the North. Northern textile mills, of course, are processing it. And in fact, the South buys a lot of cheap cloth from the North. So this is a reciprocal relationship. It's mutual. So it's grown economically by 1820 is what I'm saying, right? So slavery has grown, cotton has grown. Slavery has also expanded geographically. It's expanded southward. As I said before, northern states, as they free slaves, a lot of slaveholders are simply selling these people southward, down the river, right? It's also, of course, expanded westward beneath that Northwest Ordinance line. And of course, this is all review, but I want you to understand that this is the question: will slavery rule the West? And along with that, along with slavery, will there come the brutality and the instability that always accompanies slave societies? In fact, this expansion creates great divisions between North and South. Even as both of these areas are profiting, and both of them are tied together, they are very different societies. We know that their economies are different, and that their societies are different. We know that the South is, of course, an agrarian economy. It is based on agriculture, agrarian production, and exportation. The South has barely any industry compared to the North. The South is led by planters who have a lot of money and a lot of slaves. And they become sort of this Southern aristocracy of sorts. You know, we have a very hierarchical society, meaning a society that is set up with gradations, right? With the owner at the very top, slaves at the very bottom, and everybody else pretty much in between. And so it's the kind of society, in fact, that Northerners look down upon, because they say that's the kind of society that we actually threw off, right? With the revolution. They say we broke away from tyranny. We broke away from that sort of hierarchy with the master at the top. We want a more diverse society in terms of the economy and in terms of what kinds of people we're going to have. And this is not to say necessarily that they're into diversity. I kind of overstepped there a little bit. I'm not saying that. But we're going to see into the 1830s and 40s the growth of immigration that will feed as labor in these northern industrial manufacturing plants. So they're going to be accepting a lot of people, not necessarily because they like them, but because they're good for business. But the point is, the North and the South are very different with regard to their economies. We know that the North is highly industrial. Meanwhile, in the South, you have, like in the picture here, you see plantation owners owning several hundred slaves sometimes. And each slave at the time, depending on the kind of slave, could be worth as much as what a brand new car is today. I mean, a Kia or a Hyundai or something like that, not a Porsche, but, you know, $15,000, $20,000. And so that's a lot of money. And so there's a strong, stark social hierarchy in the South, but in the North, we're going to see a system that's based on industrialization. They're going to want to invest in transportation and manufacturing, and we're going to see a growing immigrant population into the 1840s and 50s. This is going to be a more balanced society, a more, more of a mixture of people, and a growing middle class. Now, there's still a lot of problems with regard to the mixing of people. We know that. Not people aren't going to like the Irish when they come, right? They're not going to like the free black people, all of that. But there is at least some understanding of the place within these people, and it's not necessarily slavery, the place that these people hold within these societies. And again, there's a growing middle class in the North. There's still a hierarchy, there's still a class hierarchy, but it's less sharp and there's a lot more room for mobility, meaning upward mobility, meaning you can actually rise in the North if you're a poor white man, whereas in the South, good luck. And so they're different in this regard, but they're also different in another important way, and is that the South needs the North more than the North needs the South. The North, we know, is a major buyer of cotton. But and so it needs to buy its cotton, it seems, from the South. It's cheaper there. It's part of the country. But also, I should say not also, but what they also do is engage in other forms of buying and trading. The northern economy is much more diverse than the southern economy. So if you take away cotton, just for example, if cotton were to poof disappear, the North would be, it would be hit here and there, but it could actually transition to other sorts of textiles. And it was already doing that, right? It was processing wool and other things as well, not just cotton. But if cotton were to disappear, the South would be in a shambles. And so they each have this varying view of society, and each side wants the government to work for it. Each has its own vision for the nation as it expands westward, and as the federal government is getting bigger and stronger as it does into the 1830s, both the North and the South, each one is going to be looking to the federal government to protect its interests, to further its interests, to actually create a West in their own image. And it has to do not just with the economy, but also the idea of the morality or immorality of slavery. In the North, it's not to say that, again, we have to be careful here because there's a lot of problems in the North even at this time, as we've noted, but there's a strong religious movement in the North that is anti-slavery. And in the North, you have a lot of believers in the ideals of the American Revolution. They reject that whole Southern style aristocracy thing. So they believe that slavery is immoral, it's irreligious. Again, it's not because they have any particular love for black people, but they do believe that slavery is ungodly, a lot of them. And they would tell you that slavery also is actually at the heart, or at least the basis of Southern style aristocracy. Because you have slaves at the bottom, you will naturally have someone like the slave master at the top. So they say slavery is not only immoral for religious reasons, it's immoral because it goes against the principles of the American Revolution and it creates an aristocracy. And of course, they talk about problems that slavery brings to all kinds of white folk. In fact, they develop in the North what they call the free labor ideology. In the North, they say, look, free labor is best. Free meaning people who are free getting paid. That's what they mean by free labor, not that you work for free. But free labor is, again, people who are getting paid and they are free. They're saying that slavery degrades that. Slavery degrades the value of work, the value of labor. Slavery degrades the working man because so long as slavery exists, a poor white man can't get a decent paying job because there are slaves doing it. And so they have this whole ideology about what they want to do. Notice this is not necessarily something, this is kind of a selfish thing, right? They're more worried about what it means for them as workers than what slavery means for the people who are enslaved. Along these lines, we also have something that we've already seen is that they believe you cannot be secure in a nation filled with slaves. They believe that if slavery is left to spread westward, eventually the South will have not only the South, but the West, and then eventually will be coming for the North. So a lot of people in the North fear that slavery will not just spread westward, but into the North. And a lot of people are afraid of that, not just for moral reasons, but for selfish reasons. This idea of free labor ideology, but also the worries that we talked about before revolving around equality and mixing of races. They don't like this idea. Now, in the South, a lot of this ideology in terms of free labor, all of this really fits that as well. Much of that is true. Poor whites have very little opportunity to rise, and they have little to no power. But they don't. This free labor ideology really doesn't take off in the South. Poor white folk do have an interest in slavery. As I said before, they have an interest in keeping slaves in their place. They're there already, and there's slave violence. They worry about, and so anytime a slave escapes, or anytime there is a rebellion, or anything smells like a rebellion, you're going to see poor white men round each other up, right? They're going to just come together and they're going to go out there and look for these people. They fear that, but they also fear social equality. And in the South, they believe themselves to be tied more so to white slave owners. I might be poor, but I'm white. And in fact, if any of these men had a free labor ideology, they would more likely move to the North or to the very few urban areas of the South, not in the plantation areas, you see. And that, of course, meant that these plantation areas and these rural areas were filled with slaves. And any free white men who were just trying to get by, maybe had small farms or could do odd jobs and stuff, they found it difficult. A lot of these guys would go to the cities. Now, divisions are going to deepen over time between North and South. And in fact, something's going to happen in 1820 that's really going to raise the stakes even more. Westward expansion will take the nation closer to crisis over the issue of slavery in 1820 with regard to the Missouri question. Now, the Missouri Territory at this time was part of this Louisiana Purchase. Now, recall, the Ohio River line that was the southernmost boundary of the North. Above that line, because of the Northwest Ordinance, slavery is not allowed. But again, that line is thought to have actually stopped at the Louisiana Purchase. Well, in 1819, the territory of Louisiana, and I'll show you a map in just a little while. You're gonna see Missouri actually just to the west of Kentucky there. The territory of Missouri, I should say, right, is part of Louisiana. And in 1819, the Missouri Territory applies for admission as a slave state. It wants to come in as a slave state, but there's a couple of problems here. At this point, the number of states is evenly divided between North and South. This is important for Congress, not the House of Representatives, which is based on population, but the Senate, because each state represents 2 senators. The more states you have on your side, the more senators you have on your side. At this point, they had, I think it was 11 and 11. The point is, it was balanced. Same number of states in the North as there were in the South. And they had kept it that way purposefully as the nation moved westward, because each state meant more power. And here you see the slave state, or excuse me, Missouri wanting to come in as a slave state. That will give more power to the South in the Senate, in Congress generally. And recall, we didn't go too deeply into this, but the federal government by 1820 has gotten a lot stronger than what it was when it was formed in 1787. So by 1820, both North and South understand something. Whoever controls the federal government will likely control what the nation looks like. If the North controls the federal government, then as the nation expands westward, then it's going to that West will look more like the North, free and industrial. If the South gains control of the power of the Congress, then the federal government will use that power. The South will, through the federal government, use that power really to expand itself westward, expand slavery, and expand agriculture westward. So when Missouri applies to become a slave state, the North pushes back, and they're like, "Well, wait a minute, slavery is going to spread, and we're going to lose power in the Senate." And it goes back and forth, and there's a whole bunch of rigmarole behind this that I'm not going to go into, that I typically do in a regular history class. It's enough for our purposes to know this. There's a compromise that's made. It's called the Missouri Compromise. Notice how many compromises we've already seen with regard to slavery. We've seen the Northwest Ordinance, which basically made this line of demarcation, north and south. And then, of course, we saw the compromises that were built into the Constitution. Here we have another one, 1820. Notice what they're doing. That issue of slavery was always there since the very beginning. But in fact, you're going to see that the country basically kicks the can down the road, as they say. Rather than dealing with the issue, they just kick it down the road to subsequent generations of leaders. And so you see compromise after compromise after compromise. Let's talk about what this compromise was. So if you look at the map here, okay, you're going to see in yellow Missouri. Missouri will, in fact, enter the Union as a slave state. That's a win for the South. However, the North needs something too. What does the North get? It actually gets the state of Maine up there in the top right-hand corner, as you know. Right up there. The state of Maine comes in to balance out the Senate. Now, Maine was a state that had wanted to come in for a while as a free state, but it kept getting blocked in Congress because of the South. We're like, no, 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 because we are waiting for our own state to open up in the South so we can balance it out. So that's really what happens here. Maine will enter as a free state. That's a win for the North. So we have a balance in the Senate, but we also have something else here. The Compromise of 1820 outlaws slavery north of Missouri's southern boundary. It's a little confusing. If you look at the green area, that's what I mean. Just above the yellow area to the left and above the Missouri area. So if you look at Missouri's southern line and just draw a line all the way to what starts to become Texas there, just draw it that way. And everything above that line, except Missouri, is going to be free. Everything below that line, and of course, it's a small slice there at the time because that's the only part that was still part of that was already part of the United States. That part will be open to slavery. So those are the two major things that come out of this, right? Balance in the Senate, and they actually just extend that line, right? And of course, it starts with the Ohio River and it meets Missouri, but then they just draw a line straight left to the side horizontally, and they say, you know what, slavery above there, no, slavery below that, okay. And this, of course, this line ends at the end of the territory of Louisiana because that line actually comes up in the Southwest. The Spanish are there, so it comes up against Spanish territory. Right, so that area, of course, in the bottom left-hand corner, that orangish area, that's still Spanish. Okay. Well, what are the reactions here to this whole thing? You're going to see, of course, this sort of breakdown. Already, we're seeing, you see in the blue the free states, and it really should be in gray. Beneath that, because that's where we're going with the Civil War thing. But in red, of course, you see slave states. Now, you're seeing the country be cut in half. And Northerners scream and they say, this is a victory for slavery. They say, these plantations will spread westward. Slavery will spread westward. Everything that comes along with slavery will spread westward, right? Insecurity, no good jobs for white folk. The idea that maybe, eventually, and there's a lot of people in the North who don't want to live near black people. Let's just be quite honest. And then they say, look, the land above the Missouri line that you gave us is pretty much a desert. It's not fit for white folk. The land up there in that area, in fact, they start calling it the Great American Desert. And so the Northerners are screaming about this. The Southerners are also unhappy. They don't like this. Now, I guess any good compromise is one from which both sides go away unhappy, right? The Southerners are also unhappy. They don't like that the debate, because I gave this short shrift, but this was a very intense debate that happened over the course of time, and it raises the issue of slavery like never before. So the Southerners are really upset because this debate has put the issue of slavery in the spotlight like never before. A lot of abolitionists had attended the debates, white abolitionists and black abolitionists in the North. Free black people had attended the debates. And so there's a lot of people in the country who are looking at this as possibly a turning point because we're actually getting heated up over this issue of slavery. So the Southerners are unhappy because it brings attention. Southerners are also unhappy because they say what this shows is that you want to kill slavery. You wanted Maine to come in as a free state, and you wanted Missouri to come in as a free state, but we got you to balance it out. And so this proves that you want to kill slavery. And the best way for us to actually protect slavery is to expand it. And so a lot of Southerners already in the early 1800s, they're looking westward. They're already looking into what's going to be Mexican territory later on, which is held at this point in 1820 still by Spain. So here's the thing. Both sides are looking westward, and they're thinking, okay, they're going to create slave states below the line of demarcation. We're going to create free states above it. And they're going to and they're thinking, well, eventually down the road, all we do is expand. So down the road, we might even go to the Pacific. And what we need to do is ensure that when that happens, because we're quite sure it will, when that happens, we're going to make sure that states are created in our own image. And each side is saying this. So the Missouri Compromise really signals sort of this rush to the Pacific. Southerners are flowing westward and they're bringing slaves with them. And it's becoming clear that the federal government, as it is growing and getting bigger, is going to control the future of the nation. And so the Southerners are trying to gain control of the Senate, and the Northerners are trying to gain control of the Senate. Meanwhile, that's a lot of political stuff that I'm not going to go into. The point is here, both sides are looking westward, and both sides come away from this compromise unhappy about what they got. Both sides come away thinking that it doesn't look good for their side. And so both sides, as they look westward, are more and more intent on pushing the other side back. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, he's still around at this time. He looks at the Missouri Compromise. He sees all of the conflicts surrounding this compromise, not just the debates reaching it, right, or up to it, but what happens with the compromise and how people are talking after the compromise. And he says, look, he says, Thomas Jefferson, that the Union will be shattered. This is paraphrasing, but he says that the Union will be shattered by the Missouri Compromise. He says the Missouri Compromise is in fact going to be a major turning point. What he sees is that slavery, and here's the key, slavery will shatter the Union, he says. He says this in 1820. Meanwhile, of course, into the 1820s, you're going to see a lot of people moving into these areas. By 1830, white settlers have pushed farther south and west into these areas. They have brought slavery with them. They're displacing, of course, native populations that are still in those red areas in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Tennessee, Kentucky, all those areas. But they've also pushed south into Florida. By 1819, by the way, we pick up Florida from Spain. We're not going to go into why. The point is, it's part of the United States now, okay? And of course, by 1830, there are already slave owners populating Texas, which is still part of Mexico in 1830. It's not yet part of the United States, but U.S. settlers are going there and they're bringing their slaves over. White settlers are swarming into these areas, bringing the slaves with them. Slaves are being forced, and by the way, with the movement of these people, it's going to open up the domestic slave trade. While the North is in fact getting rid of slavery slowly, the West is opening up to slavery, right? And Northerners, a lot of them, are selling their slaves not just southward but westward. And what you're going to see is slaves forced onto boats and onto wagons, or forced to march on foot for countless miles, some of them sometimes still enchained. In fact, they're going to call this the New Middle Passage. Sometimes it's called the Second Middle Passage. I call it the New Middle Passage, where people are forced not, you remember the Middle Passage, of course, that's over the Atlantic. This New Middle Passage is the movement of thousands of slaves from the east to the west. They're coming, a lot of them coming from the north, but also coming from the south, where people are coming and bringing and trying to expand their plantation and their interest from the U.S. South into the West. So these journeys are much like what their ancestors went through. Families are torn apart. Children are torn from their mothers. Married people are separated forever. And they're traded like animals. They're oiled up, inspected, made to jump and dance, all the same way that that this happened before with the Middle Passage. But as this is happening, slaves and free black people are going to continue to challenge slavery, especially slaves, because as things get much more restrictive of them, they're going to become much more resistant. An example of this happens early on in 1800. Oh, this map here was just sort of, those are the areas where slavery is really moving into by about 1830. Of course, you see parts of Texas and so forth. These areas over here, of course, Oklahoma, just north of Texas, and of course, Missouri and all those areas there, Arkansas. So I should have shown you that before, but I don't think you really missed anything. The point is, this is a map showing the movement of slaves. This is where you're seeing, and notice, what's happening is that the country's being, of course, kind of cut in half. Okay, back to slave resistance. There's this guy named Denmark Vesey. I'll give you a little background on him. Right around 1800, this guy actually scrapes together like money from his side jobs. He's got some side gigs going on. Some slaves, remember, were permitted to do this by owners who would sometimes take a portion of it. In 1800, he scrapes together some money. He buys a lottery ticket and he wins $1,500. That's like $30,000 in today's money. This guy buys his own freedom. This is a slave who hits the lottery. I mean, that's really hitting the lottery, right? Able to do that and buy your own freedom. He sets up his own carpentry business because he was actually a skilled slave, which is how he was able to, of course, to get enough money together to afford lottery tickets. If you can afford lottery tickets, then maybe you can actually afford food, right? At least I hope so. Not always. I've seen things, boy. But anyway, I digress. So he sets up his carpentry business. He has skills. He's got some business sharpness, business acumen, right? But he doesn't turn his back on slaves. He actually still keeps on hanging on out with slaves. He hangs out with them. He helps them out here and there as best he can. And he, in 1820, will become inspired by the Missouri Compromise debate and what happens already with the Haitian Revolution. So early on, Haitian Revolution already by 1800 has already heated him up. But in 1820, the Missouri Compromise debate heats him up even more. So what does he do? He hatches a plot. He hatches a plot among slaves to free the city of Charleston. He plans on actually freeing Charleston of slaves and then taking on, and this is Charleston, South Carolina, right? And taking these people, sailing off to Haiti, to this promised land of sorts. Unfortunately for these people, this plot is given up by 2 slaves. Denmark Vesey in 1822 and 5 others is hanged. This slave plot leads to more restrictions. Notice every time, I mean, I keep saying this, it's like a broken record, right? It leads South Carolina and other southern states to again tighten their grip on slavery, slaves, free black people. So we have, for example, new codes being, and you've seen these in different places, these kinds of codes, but here we have something new with South Carolina, no hiring out. Remember what hiring out was, right? When you could actually hire yourself out and make a little money on the side, as I said. They said none of that because this guy who was once a slave was able to get enough money together, hit the lottery, and then become somebody. We can't allow that. Also, there are new black laws that are put in place. Oh, and by the way, the old slave laws, slave codes are actually beefed up as well. Slave patrols are beefed up. Laws against teaching slaves to read, those are beefed up because Denmark Vesey knew how to read. So they're cutting all that. They're trying to cut that stuff down. But it's not just slave codes. It is also the the black laws that are put in place. So, for example, they require any free black young man to be apprenticed, meaning he must learn a skill, and that way he's not on the street. And so the idea is that free black men, because they are considered, I suppose, they're considered to be much more likely or more dangerous, I suppose, maybe not just through violence, but more likely to actually run away, which is pretty much true. These free black men must be watched. And these young men are forced into apprenticeship. So they're forced into becoming, getting a skill at least. So there's nothing wrong with having a skill that kind of helps them, but they have no choice. They're not slaves because they're getting something out of this, and so and sometimes they get a little bit of room and board, right? But they're not slaves, but they're not free, I should say. Another thing about free black laws is that free black people can't hire slaves. So if you are a free black person, you cannot hire a slave to work for you. So the idea, of course, is to separate free black people from enslaved black people. So they're making these black laws to do this. And if, in fact, you are someone who is a free black person, if you leave the state and you come back, you will be re-enslaved. And so notice what they're doing, right? They're not just cracking down on slaves with the new slave codes and beefing up the old ones, but they're also passing these black laws to separate black people from each other, free from enslaved. You're a free black person, you can't hire a slave. You are a free black person, you leave the state, you come back, we don't want to see you. We do not, you are too much of a powerful contradiction to what we have going on here. We don't want our slaves to see a free black man. So get out. And those free black people who are here, you're going to be apprenticed. You're going to be watched, the black men. And so more of the same. Slaves, though, are not giving up. And you will see in the early 1800s, in fact, more slave rebellions, right? So we've already seen Gabriel's Rebellion, 1800. We've seen 1822, the plot by Denmark Vesey. And then in 1831, we have, in fact, probably the most famous rebellion in U.S. history. Now, you should watch the video that I posted on this, and make sure you read the book on this. And matter of fact, make sure you do all the reading, right? Because I'm going to take stuff from there too. But here's the thing. Nat Turner, he was, in fact, one of these people who embraced evangelical Christianity with what was known as the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great, we know that the First Great Awakening, they didn't know it was the first, but they just called it the Great Awakening, right? The Great Awakening initially starts in like the 1730s, 1740s. Well, almost 100 years later, there's a Second Great Awakening, and it's much like the first. It's this whole revival of religion. This one is different in the sense that many, many more black people are in fact converted to Christianity than there were 100 years before. These people are, quote unquote, more Americanized by now. They're more likely to embrace new ideas, and they've already been familiar with Christianity. When the Second Great Awakening takes off, you're going to see a lot of them convert, and you will see a lot of masters, in fact, allow this. Well, Nat Turner is one of these men who embraces evangelical Christianity. He becomes a preacher among his people. He claims he's a prophet, and he will lead the most bloody and disturbing slave rebellion in our history. This rebellion in 1831 in Virginia horrifies white folk. I will let you watch the video so you can see what it's about, but it's pretty horrific. After this insurrection, a lot of the white folk are like, what do we do? This was the most horrible thing we've ever seen. What do we do? Should we outlaw slavery? In fact, Virginia was on the cusp, on the edge of outlawing slavery because of this rebellion, because it brings to the point the fact that wherever slaves exist, they will rise up and they will kill you. And so a lot of people were thinking, maybe we need to outlaw slavery. So there was this point in time right after this rebellion when it looked like maybe there was a chance. But instead, the Virginia legislature goes the other way. They start cracking down even more, embracing slavery like never before, and restricting the lives of not just free Black people, but of slaves. And again, you really need to watch that video to get a fuller appreciation for what I'm talking about here. They, of course, are going to brutally crush this rebellion, kill whatever Black person is around. When the rebellion rises up, it gets crushed. And there's going to be a backlash against slavery and against free Black people. There are laws in Virginia that are passed that say a Black person can't preach without a white man there. Law in Virginia is passed that actually says that they start to actually raise taxes in Virginia to actually remove all the free Black people and colonize them. Remember that whole colonization thing? So after Nat Turner's rebellion, Virginia begins to raise taxes to actually send free people to Africa. And this happens in other states as well. And so Black people are going to be cracked down upon just generally. In addition to all the brutality that slaves, even those people who had nothing to do with Nat Turner's rebellion, even all that brutality that's heaped on them. But something else happens, and this happens at the national level, and that is that Congress in 1835 passes what's known as the gag rule in Congress. This basically puts a gag over any U.S. congressman, and they were men at the time, right? Where you cannot talk against slavery in Congress. We will not give you the floor if you want to criticize anyhow, in any way, oppose slavery. All of this, the gag rule and everything else, is going to raise the issue of slavery to a whole new degree. First of all, in the North, people will say, what the heck? What do you mean Congress cannot talk about this? What kind of country are we? We're supposed to be a democracy. To them, in the North, a lot of people, it sends the message that the slaveholders want something like what they got rid of in 1776 to 1783 during the American Revolution. A lot of people in the North are thinking, what you want is a slaveocracy, where you want slaves at the bottom and an aristocracy at the top. You want to spread yourself across the country. Even racial bigots say wherever slavery exists, a free white man can't get a good job, can't get good wages, and can't even speak his mind. Because in fact, one of the things that was also happening at this time was that states passing laws against that would prohibit a regular person from speaking on the issue of slavery against slavery anywhere in these states. Let me just restate that because I'm a little bit off. So you might have noticed I'm a little off today, not feeling quite well. So here's the thing. A lot of white people are decrying what the South is doing. They call it a slaveocracy. And this, of course, brings in that whole idea of, you know, the free labor ideology, but also liberties. Here, the right to speak. Because after Nat Turner's rebellion, states were passing all kinds of laws that were restricting black people, but they also were passing laws that were restricting white people's ability to speak. Now, you might be a white man in the South who does not care about slavery, one way or the other. Maybe you don't, but you might be someone who actually wants to be able to speak his mind if he feels like it. So there were people like this, and a lot of them, of course, lived in the North. People who said, "Wait a minute, this is what you want for the country. As we move out west, you're going to have slave societies out there where a white man not only can't get a job and good wages, but he can't speak his mind." So Nat Turner's rebellion is gonna really raise the stakes on this, and I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. I just want to tell you something interesting about this, and it's kind of disturbing. Nat Turner is, you'll see, he was captured. Obviously, this whole thing was, the whole thing was crushed. But Nat Turner is going to be hanged, skinned, and boiled down and dismembered. His body will be used, his skin, for example, will be used to make things like purses. His body will be boiled down, and they will make grease, like for ointments, like salves on your skin. You know, like if you ever have like a muscle ache or something, you put some grease and stuff on it. They do this, and his bones are going to be actually passed out as trophies to local families who were victims in some sense of the insurrection. So this is some pretty disturbing stuff. And this is only one instance in which this sort of thing happens. We're going to see a lot more of it down the road when we look at lynching. What's interesting is that there's no statue to Nat Turner that I can think of, that I know of. Compare Denmark Vesey, right? I mean, he had a statue to him. You notice that? Denmark Vesey's got a statue to him. What's the difference? Well, Denmark Vesey can be looked at as a freedom fighter because he was about to rise up and fight for his rights. But it never got off the ground, and then he was executed. Meanwhile, what did Nat Turner do? So Denmark Vesey perhaps can be seen as a freedom fighter, a revolutionary, maybe even a hero. But I guess Nat Turner cannot be. But here's the thing about Nat Turner's rebellion, is that it raises the issue of slavery like never before. People wonder, how could anyone butcher people the way he and his men did? The Southerners are saying, well, that's because slaves are animalistic, and they are encouraged by whites in the North to actually oppose their condition. So the Southerners have their own view. They're animalistic. They're these outside agitators, whites in the North, who are putting ideas of freedom in their heads. People in the North are saying, wait a minute, no. You want to understand how anyone can butcher people the way he and his men did? Well, look at what you're doing with regard to slavery. Slavery dehumanizes people. Slavery dehumanizes everyone that is involved. It dehumanizes the people who are enslaved, makes them into, you might want to say monsters, to put it badly. Also, it dehumanizes people who enslave people. How does it dehumanize the enslaver? Well, I mean, think about it. I mean, when I was growing up, there was this kid down the street from us who um, he used to like to torture animals, and so I don't know if this metaphor is going to go a long way here, but there's an analogy here, and that is that if you are someone who frequently tortures, maybe you don't even like to, but you think you have to, whatever, you torture another being. What does that say about you? And so Northerners are saying this. They're saying, look, South, you the reason that this is happening is because of your intent to hold on to slavery. And so after Nat Turner's rebellion, we have all these everybody cracking down. We see states cracking down in the ways that we mentioned, and when they crack down, you're going to see more rebellion among slaves, more violence, more attention to the issue. In fact, as I mentioned, this is going to be a turning point toward the Civil War. But of course, slaves are not just resisting in this way. They're resisting in more subtle ways. They're resisting in all the ways that we talked about, right? And this is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. We talked about this before, right? But even 100 or so years later, they're still rebelling, they're running away, but they're also, of course, engaging in more covert, meaning undercover forms of rebellion. One of these, of course, is forming family ties. Now, we talked about this already, but it really should be spoken of again, and that's that we're going to see what become known as fictive kin, right? With all the movement of slaves around, as I've mentioned, especially with that New Middle Passage, right? There are people getting moved around just like their forebears with the original Middle Passage, and they're creating new families. You're seeing families torn apart and families formed together. So they're creating what are known as fictive kin. They're not blood, but as far as they're concerned, they're real kin. So they're forming family ties through these fictive kin relationships. They're forming family ties by marrying abroad. Marrying abroad is, and we've touched on this, but it just basically means when someone is married abroad, it means that your spouse, you might be on one plantation, but your spouse is on the other plantation. You marry abroad. Now, you might think this is kind of strange. Why would you do that? If there are marriageable partners, perhaps in your own slave quarters area, why would you do that? But think about it. How, and yes, that did happen, right? There were, of course, many people like that, but others decided to marry abroad, perhaps for practical reasons. Maybe there wasn't somebody around that they liked, but also, how would you feel if you were living with your spouse every single day, seeing that person degraded and pushed around and brutalized sometimes? How would you feel? So if you're married abroad, you don't have to see your loved one being tortured this way every day, not just physically, but psychologically. So they're engaging in these forms of family formation, right? They're also, of course, teaching their children their culture. They teach their young how you survive under these horrific circumstances. So they're carrying their culture with them. One important aspect of culture, of course, is religion, and what you have is what historians come to call the invisible church, where a lot of these black people who are not going to be allowed to preach because, and they're not going to be allowed to preach outside the eyes of white people, white gays. They're going to go, as I mentioned this before, this is going to be happening more by this time with all the new laws that are restricting. They're going to go, they're going to pray in their slave quarters. They might go off into the woods behind their little area there and have their Christian sorts of revivalist sorts of sermons and not quite a mass, but you get the point. Their services. And here, of course, with this in this invisible church, it's not visible to white men generally, white people generally, and so that's why people call it the invisible church. But here's where they speak of equality and justice and freedom. Now, none of this should be read to mean that slavery was not brutal, horrid, utterly contemptible. all it means is that people find ways to make their lives as they are suffering under these sorts of circumstances. We have to, though, recognize the dire circumstances in order to appreciate the strength of people who lived through it and still tried to cobble together for themselves, to sew together for themselves some future. We have to recognize that. And we should recognize, and I said this earlier, but I told you I was going to come back to it, that slavery in the Western Hemisphere was the most brutal form of human bondage that the world has ever seen. We know that there was slavery in the Old World. We know that the Greeks and the Romans held slaves. We know native peoples enslaved each other. We know Africans enslaved each other. But and you might hear people say this. Well, so what, right? Why is it that the United States gets a bad rap? And it's not just the United States. Well, I'm talking about the Western Hemisphere. Some of the worst forms of slavery were in the Caribbean and in Brazil. But we're talking about U.S. history here, African American history, right? So the U.S. form of slavery was, in fact, part of this Atlantic system, this Western Hemispheric system, that was, in fact, the worst form of human bondage. So, for example, in the United States, there's going to be differences in how slaves were held as opposed to how they were held under these other systems that we just mentioned. I'll give you a couple of examples, a couple of differences. In the United States, the New World slavery, I should put it that way, it's gonna, we have to look at how skin color comes into play. In the New World, only Black people will be enslaved. In the Old World, it was not based on skin color. It is in the New World. In the Old World, Greeks enslaved other Greeks. Romans enslaved other, I guess we can call them white people. They didn't think of it that way at the time, but they enslaved people who looked like them. Native peoples and Africans, they enslaved people who looked like themselves, other tribesmen. So skin color wasn't the basis of slavery as it is in the New World. There's also a difference with the reason for enslavement. In the Old World, you enslaved somebody for different reasons. Very often, you took them as captives of war, and so if prisoner of war, right? And then you take them with you. Also, sometimes debtors. If you owe me money, I can enslave you. Or you might owe me a blood debt. Like, let's say you killed my cousin, you're going to become my slave. So in the Old World, the reason for enslavement was varied. Yes, it could be money, but usually lent. It's not that I'm just going to capture you and make money off of you, not generally. But it was for, debt, blood debt, captives of war. Also, another reason was status. A lot of the slaves, like in Greek times and Roman times, these were high status. These were people who were teachers of the young. These sometimes were learned folk. And a slave owner who owned someone like this had a high status. And a slave owner who owned people who weren't even all that bright, in fact, had a high status because this was a property issue. In the New World, none of this is going to really be true. In the New World, it's not about debtors, it's not about captives of war, but it's going to be purely economics. The one thing that I will say, though, is that status, of course, has something to do with it. In the New World, in the United States, in fact, owning a slave becomes the American dream, so to speak. But it's based purely on economics and, again, based purely on skin color. There's also a difference in limitations on who can be enslaved. In the Old World, traditionally, you did not enslave people of your own religion. And in the Old World, slavery was not usually based on condition of the parents. In the New World, these are different. The reason the reasons you're enslaved, right? So Christianity can't save you. It doesn't matter that you're a Christian. Now, in the early years, English settlers sort of struggle with this, but they made their peace with it. Christianity can't save you. And of course, we have the condition of the mother. Here, The condition of the mother is what dictates whether or not you are a slave. Another difference is possibilities for freedom. In the old world, it's going to be a lot easier to gain freedom. In the new world, as we've seen, it gets harder and harder to get. And in fact, in the old world, if you gain your freedom, you could actually become a citizen of the people, the society that enslaved you. For example, the Greek slaves could become actual citizens. In Native American and African communities, sometimes slaves would be adopted into their tribes. They would become family members. In the New World, not even free Black people in the United States are considered citizens. And of course, they are not going to be considered part of the community. Now, this is not to say that slavery in the old world was never harsh, because certain aspects of these things existed in the old world, and it's really, really difficult to separate them out. But here's what I want you to understand that I hope will encapsulate this, right? And is that slavery in the old world had its problems. Excuse me. But also certain aspects of New World slavery, and I said that I shouldn't say it that way, had its problems. What I mean is that slavery in the old world, of course, could have been really, really hard on a lot of people, right? But there were certain aspects of New World slavery that did not exist in the old world. And all the worst aspects of all the slave systems of the ancient world were brought to bear in the United States. So, when people say, well, slavery is just slavery. No, it's not. I mean, I get that. If you can say, well, slavery is not freedom. I understand that. But tell that to a slave who's living in New England, whose son just got sold to the Caribbean. Slavery is not just slavery when it comes down to something like that. We know that slavery in the United States is less harsh in the North than it is in the South. We know that. I mean, yes, in the North, you're still a slave. You can't protect your kids and you have no political freedoms. But as we've noted, there's a growing difference. The plantation Southern slavery was the worst in the United States. We have brutal punishments, not just physical, but psychological punishments. And here's a picture of, and very often you would see Black slave drivers. You'd see Black men whipping other Black men or women. And of course, this was a way for to create divisions between the Black community. And you might think, well, this guy's a sellout, but you got to remember something. I mean, what are your choices here? Somebody gives you a whip, and your choice is you're going to wield the whip or you're going to get whipped with it. Which one? They show you a whip. Which one do you want? Do you want to be the one whipping, or would you rather be the one that's getting whipped? I don't know how to answer that because I didn't have to live through that, and neither did you. But they would have what are called Black drivers. And so we're talking brutal, brutal punishments. And they're cared for. These slaves are cared for like animals. I mean, they're not housed very well. Their housing is small and cramped, and it's like, it's like barracks, right? In bunks. These houses are drafty, they're leaky, their floors are made of dirt, and there's a lot of disease in these places. And so they're not treated very well. And they're barely clothed. Barely clothed. Slaves were actually clothed in what were called Negro cloth. This was very cheap stuff that they would buy from the North. It's processed in the North. Sometimes cotton, very often wool. Can you imagine? Working in the South Carolina swamps in rice, and then later on cotton, clothed in wool in the middle of summer. In fact, a lot of young kids would run around kind of naked or half naked. The older ones would wear almost a tunic that was just that was like a hole for your head to go through, and maybe something to tie around your waist. Very often, you're just running down the road with your butt hanging out, literally. And so, they're not treated very well. And this needs to be said because for a long time, and even today, you hear people say, well, slaves didn't have it so bad. They were fed, they were clothed, right? I mean, come on. They were treated almost like animal. You would treat an animal that does work for you. In the same way that you would maybe protect an animal in terms of shelter and a saddle or whatever, you would give them these things. Also, in terms of food, they were barely fed. In fact, they got the worst pieces of the pig. You may have heard the saying high off the hog. A lot of my students today, a lot of the younger ones, they've never heard of this. I think we're actually losing a lot of our idioms, right? Our sort of expressions. I've noticed that. But high off the hog, you might have heard this. And what that means is that there are certain parts of the pig that are the better parts, right? So the better parts are the higher parts, right? You have the back, right? Middle cut, you got the ribs there. Ham's pretty good. The shoulder, not bad. But then you get to the bottom, the belly, the feet, and the pig's head is usually in the dirt, right? And so the pig's snout and the ears, that's all stuff that is, considered low off the hog. The slaves would get the ears, they would get the snout, they would get the pig's feet, and they would get the belly, the entrails, right? Where and this of course becomes part of black soul food. I lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and there's a large black population in Cleveland, Ohio. About 50% black, probably. I went to a school that was almost all black. I think I mentioned that before. And we were all poor and stuff. And my friends, they were descended from people who had come from the South, and they would eat a lot of soul food. Talking about eating pig's feet and pig ears and pig snout and eating chitlins, right? Chitlins, you may know, of course, are pig guts. And I remember going into my friend's house and like, what the heck is that smell? And it smelled, honestly, it smelled like feces. But the grandmother was cleaning out the chitlins, right? Cleaning it out so she could cook them. And this is not healthy stuff, and it's not the best part of the pig. I mean, how many people like to eat chitlins? I don't know. I'm sure a lot of them do, but I don't know many, to be quite honest. And so this phrase high off the hog actually comes from this period of time when people were given certain parts of the pig and to live, and they were living low off the hog. And this diet, this soul food diet, by the way, is in fact it's pretty unhealthy. It may be why so many, historically, really in the last couple of decades, that this might be changing, but a lot of hypertension and heart problems are among black people, especially black men. So they're not housed well, they're barely clothed, they're treated harshly, they're barely fed, and of course they're forced to work in the fields. And men and women work in the fields, mostly men, a lot of women, and they're working 60, 70 hours a week at least. And of course, they have to, all the slaves have to obey, and all the slaves really are denied their own individuality to a point. The master does everything he can to destroy it. Sorry, give me 1 second. Enslaved women suffer immensely. All these women are subject to being raped by the owner or the owner's sons. Sometimes they are even raped in front of the husband of the slave as punishment. You can imagine the effect on slave families. You can imagine the effect on the man-woman relationship among slaves. If the master has the power to hold down the husband, chain him down, make him watch as the owner has his way with the wife, how does that affect the relationship between husband and wife? From the woman's point of view, she knows that The husband couldn't do anything. But internally, she might still be thinking, he couldn't protect me. From the man's point of view, he might think, well, obviously she had no choice. But being a man, he might think, did she like it? These are horrible sorts of things to think about, but you can imagine the kinds of psychological processes that are going through these people's minds. And of course, these women would often give birth to half-white children, raising the son of the master, seeing their own child being brutalized by the same man who fathered the child, who does not even recognize the child as his own. Certainly not officially. Now, some slave women, some slave girls in particular, become mistresses. And by the way, again, you're seeing slaveholders probably in their 40s, 50s, whatever, and they start looking at these young girls already when they come of age, right? When they're coming of age, and starting to develop. And so very often you're talking about an old man with a very young girl. Look at Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, for example. She becomes his mistress. What if a young girl, in fact, what if she agrees to become his mistress? What if she pursues the man? Is this still rape? Yes, it is, because there's a difference in power. Do you really think that this young girl would, under ordinary circumstances, under good circumstances, I should say, actually go after this older man? I doubt it. But under the slave system, a young girl might decide, I have something that he wants. And if I'm nice to him, maybe he's nice to me. And I can't fault people for trying to survive that way. I just won't. I've never been through that. I'm not a woman, and I'm never been a slave. And of course, this will cause lots of problems with the slaveholder's wife. Now, as a proper lady, the slaveholder's wife can't throw it in the man's face. She can't talk about this. In fact, she ignores it, even though everybody knows what's happening. I mean, there's a bunch of half-white, half-black children running around your yard. You know where they came from. There was this one woman, I can't remember her name, but she was a writer from the South, and she said that slave women look at these half-black, half-white children, and they act like they just dropped from the skies, when everybody knows what's happening. But the slaveholder's wife can't say much about it, because everybody knows that this is how it's always been. That's just the way it is. You married this fool knowing that it was going to be this way. Your mother went through the same thing. So she can't really do much about it. So who does she take it out on? Of course, the young girl. So, we can talk at length about the psychological processes that are going on here, but I can only, as a man living today, begin to imagine the kinds of things that, the kinds of experiences that these women had. Sometimes they're forced into a marriage with another black man, another slave. Sometimes they're locked into a cabin until the woman comes out pregnant. This is going to sound horrible, but here's the thing. They didn't really know about genetics then, but they do know that people resemble their parents. So a slave master may take a certain kind of slave, the biggest and darkest one, and man, and pair him with the biggest and darkest female. Put them together until the woman comes out pregnant. And of course, this is rape by black men, of course, because women they're not necessarily going to like this either. But here's the point: they're looked at, some of these women, as good breeders. All of this, of course, is disturbing. It should be, but it's something that people had to live through. We can at least talk about it. Pregnant slaves as women sometimes are given more food, more little trinkets as gifts. Sometimes, they're given lighter work, but if they get out of hand, they're still going to be whipped. Brutal whippings. Some of these women were whipped while pregnant. The master would have a hole dug, lay the woman face down with a fetus in the hole in the ground to protect it, and just whip her back and her the back of her their back and her legs and her buttocks, everything. And so a lot of these women would still sometimes have very unhealthy pregnancies. There would be miscarriages and stillbirths, and still forced to go back to work shortly after giving birth. You know, white people for a long time at this time believed that black women withstood pregnancy and childbearing better than white women. They saw them much like they saw livestock. What's interesting is that they knew they were human. How do we know this? Well, because these men were having sex with women. I mean, they know they're not animals. So here I'm about to switch slides, but here you can see, you know, the Virginia luxury is that you can be a slave master and enjoy the wife as you beat the husband, is the thinking here behind this print. So I think that says it all. You know, with regard to children, I mean, the children are working by age 5. Boys are in the field working in the fields by age 10. And the girls are in the kitchen or doing other what they would call women's work at the time. And these children, of course, are often sold away, as you can see here. And the mothers, the family have no choice. So you have a lot of these people. I mean, how can I wrap this up? I don't know. I mean, I can't even wrap my head around it. These were, I mean, maybe thinking about this will help you understand why Nat Turner did the things that he did. Keep this in the back of your mind when you think about Nat Turner. Now, interestingly enough, there were divisions among slaves even on plantations. They didn't all see each other the same, interestingly enough. There was this major difference, really, between field slaves, didn't mean to do that, field slaves and house slaves. Now, if you worked in the field, you were going to be more likely to be engaged in back-breaking work with chain gangs and a very, very poor diet, right? In the sun, and you know, if you're a worker in the field, then your slave quarters are away from the big house. If you were a house slave, you had more perks, you had more benefits. You're fed better because, you know, you're probably going to be getting some scraps from the kitchen, leftovers perhaps. So you're fed better. You're lighter skinned. Why? Not just because you're not likely to be working in the hot sun all day, although that probably has something to do with it, but you're lighter skinned because you're probably the daughter or son of the person of the master and the domestic slave that he had there living with him. You're also more likely able to read, perhaps. And what's happened sometimes is that children, even though there were laws against teaching slaves to read, children would sometimes say, "Well, I'm going to do it." You know, children are children, right? So they would teach slaves to read sometimes, and they were more likely to speak better English than the field slaves. So they get more perks as well, right? They get more perks. They're fed better. They're able to read, speak, you know, better English. The lighter skin, I guess. I don't mean that as a perk, but the point is these are differences, and they get more perks in the sense that they're living inside the house. And I mentioned this before. They are domestic slaves, therefore they are are going to be feared in a particular way because they're the ones who are cooking your meals. They're the ones sleeping outside your, the foot maybe at the foot of your bed, or at least outside in the hallway. Now, these people, of course, are still slaves. Now, which one would you choose if you had to choose? Now, it's interesting because when I was growing up in Cleveland, my black friends had this sort of thing where they called each other like, "Oh, you're just a house N," or "You're just a field N," right? And somebody might be called a house N if they were thought that they were thought to be perhaps a little too close to white folk, right? If you were a black person who was doing his job and was working well, others might be like, "Oh, you're just trying to suck up to the man, the boss. You're a house N." Of course, on the other side, some people were seen as backwards with poor language skills and all these things, and they would say, "Oh, you're a field N. You don't know anything." And so my point in bringing that up is simply this: we still see this division today among the black community. And I don't know how much it still exists, but my sense is that it's still there to a degree. Let me get back to this question. Who would you rather choose to be if you had to be a slave, a field slave or a house slave? And I guess maybe the question would be, would it matter if you were a young girl, 12, 13 years old, just becoming close to becoming a woman? If you're living in the house, you're more likely to be accessible to the man. Also, if you are a domestic slave, you could be forced to be a wet nurse for the master's children. What does that mean? You could be forced to nurse the children of the slave owner's wife or the slave owner's daughters, because they're not going to do it. And if you are a woman who is a wet nurse for these children, these white children, and here's another example of how they knew they were people. Not only is the master having sex with these women, but the family is allowing this woman to feed the child from her breast. So they knew they were people. And these women would have to nurse the white children, the slave owner's children, or the children of the family, before they would actually feed their own children. Sometimes there wouldn't be any milk left for her own child. So, this is a mental exercise. Which would you like to be? It depends, I think. And I don't even know that I could answer that. It's just something that is beyond me, to be quite honest. So, as the nation moves forward, it moves westward in the 1830s, more and more people are going to question slavery. They are calling it the fundamental paradox. How is it that slavery has taken hold and is spreading and may even not just threaten the West, but maybe threaten the North, and as it has effects on jobs and freedoms and safety, also the inhumanity of it. When we are a nation that's supposed to be built on ideas of freedom and equality. The Constitution there, we the people. Who were the people? At this point, can we say that these people were considered to be part of what we know to be an American, quote unquote? Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and I hope this made sense. Again, if you had questions, if you have any questions, please give me a call. I'm going to sign off now. Be good and be well. Take care.